We'll try that again. Hey, good morning, devs. Welcome back again to everybody that's joining live, whether now or in a little bit. And definitely welcome to everybody that is tuning into the recording after the fact. Back again, we're going to keep working on our Ktor project. And in particular, we've got two things planned out for the day. So the first thing that I want to work on today is to look at one of our GitHub tickets that we had created in one of the previous streams. And that ticket has some acceptance criteria in it. And I want to walk through how we might start to sketch out an implementation plan for those acceptance criteria. This was one of the questions on a recent stream or video. I forget exactly where, but somewhere on YouTube, I got a question about how do we break down a topic? How do we kind of build up the skill of kind of logical thinking and, being able to execute on one of our tickets? So I started writing an implementation plan for what I wanted to do on the stream today and figured I would just do it live, save a little bit of time, work through it there. So we'll do that. And then we will work through the actual task at hand, which is going to be to start stubbing out some REST endpoints for this Ktor service that we have been working through. So that's the rough timeline for the day. Let's just jump right in here. Hello, welcome to everybody that's popping in and saying hi. Thank you, appreciate it. So here we have our ticket. And so we stubbed this out a couple streams ago, and the idea for this one is to stub out the initial endpoints for our application here. And we've got a handful of acceptance criteria for this. And so just kind of quickly running through them, we want to add a get status endpoint that'll serve as a basic health check for the service. That health check should be able to return environment-specific information about where it is deployed. So think hitting the endpoint and having it indicate whether it's a dev deployment or a prod deployment. Then we're going to add 3 more endpoints, one for a get URLs, which will return a list of the metadata about URLs that we've shortened. We're going to have a get endpoint that takes an ID parameter, and that will eventually turn in the endpoint we can use to actually shorten our URL, to resolve a shortened URL. And then we are going to build out a post endpoint that will actually allow us to make a request and save a URL, shorten it, and then be able to resolve that later. And then just a couple other requirements here. We want to be able to serialize and return all of our responses using typed objects, and we'll do that via content negotiation. And all of our post bodies should also be typed objects, leveraging content negotiation as well. So that's kind of the high level requirements of what I wanted to achieve with this particular ticket here. So the first thing then, before I get into that, with any task, whether it's, a stream here or it's a task at work or a side project, it's a good idea to think a little bit ahead of time, maybe a lot ahead of time if it's a large task, about how you want to actually go about executing on this task, how you want to build it out, because it'll often save you a lot of time in the long run and give you a roadmap to be able to just start checking things off your list as you're building this out. Before I jump into that, I see some comments here in the chat. I'm going to throw this one up in particular here. Cucumber REST API with Ktor and how to bootstrap it. I do not know that much about that particular topic, but it very much sounds interesting. I would love to do some one-off streams here and there. So I will kind of make a note of this. I'll look into it a little bit, and maybe we can do that in a future stream, because I would love to explore some other kind of APIs and different ways of structuring services with Ktor. So I think that'd be great. Thank you for the suggestion. And also, I'll throw this one up. I really appreciate the feedback. Thank you for for tuning in, and I'm glad to have you here. Thank you. Awesome. All right. So we've got our acceptance criteria. There's a handful of ways we could go about, whoops, still got a comment up there. There we go. So we have our acceptance criteria now. Now let's think about how we might start to break this down task by task. And really there's a number of ways we could go about doing this. We could just kind of go down the list of acceptance criteria and write out all of the implementation steps needed to achieve those. We could look at this more holistically and maybe start with some things that we know we will need to do ahead of time to serve these goals, or really a combination of both. And that last one there, the combination of both, I think that's what I want to go with here, because I know that there's a few just kind of boilerplate things that I'll need to do at the beginning of this, and I would rather just knock those out right off the bat. So the first thing that I know I'm going to need to do here to serve these last two acceptance criteria is that I'm going to need to add the kotlinx.serialization plugin to the project so I can serialize out request responses and post bodies. There we go. So we've got one dependency to add there. Now I also know that when I'm working through my endpoints that I want to use Ktor's resource plugin to be able to define type-safe routes in my project. So I will also make an implementation note here to add the Ktor resources plugin. And then I know, and here, let me just break this down. This will help us, I think, group this even more. So we're going to have kind of one subsection of the plan here that will be add needed dependencies. Then I'm going to add another section here for add required data types. So if we kind of look through the acceptance criteria here, and we kind of think through each of these points, we see the first endpoint, get status. And normally that get status, it might just return a 200 and you wouldn't need any extra data type there. But for the second bullet point, the acceptance criteria states that we should be able to return some environment information in the response body. And so for that, I want to create in, let's see, I'll call it maybe application info data class to store environment and revision properties. Then for my get URLs endpoint, we mentioned that this should return a list of shortened URL data. Now we might think long-term about this probably going out and requesting data from a database. So we'll have some database records. We'll probably map that into some other object here and return that back to the caller. So we can start to stub that out here. I will call this create in, maybe we'll call this shortened URL, or maybe URL metadata. Nah, I'm gonna go with shortened URL for now. Shortened URL data class to store, and I think for this, we might want to store a few properties on this. So we might want to store, well, we definitely want to store the actual URL. Then we might want to store, let's say, a ID initially for that URL to represent maybe like a future database record in that. And see, do we want to store anything else here? That's probably fine for now. If we think about something, we can add it later. And let's see, what else are we going to need here? So we have get URLs. We have an endpoint for getting an ID, but the way this will work likely is eventually we will just do a redirect here. So I don't know that we're going to need any additional response body for this one at the moment. For now, we can probably get away with just returning our shortened URL data class. So I think the last thing we're going to need here is maybe something to represent this URL data body that'll go to our post endpoint. So for this one here, we'll stub out a requirement to create a, let's say, shorten URL request body data class to provide the URL to shorten. So that we can include with our post body, and then we'll use that to store into our, eventually into our table of URLs that we're holding on to. So now to just kind of recap here, because it's good as we're breaking this down, we want to make sure we kind of know where we're going along the way. So, we've identified that we need to add some dependencies to the project before we can really build out what we want to. We have then identified 3 data classes that we want to implement that will be used as we implement the specific behavior of these endpoints as we're stubbing them out. And so now we could actually get into the endpoint behavior itself. So we could stub out, say stub out endpoints. So the first one here, we'll say stub out get status, we'll say without resource class. And then we can just test out the get status endpoint just to make sure that our initial implementation there is working just fine. We'll make sure we test that the first time. And then we will refactor our get status endpoint using type safe resource to define the route. And then once we have this, we could go ahead and implement an extension property. Well, actually, before I do this, so at this point, we'll have an endpoint that could just return a 200, let's say. But in our second acceptance criteria here, we have this requirement to return environment information in that response body to the status endpoint. So there's a number of ways we could do this. And ultimately, we're just going to be reading from environment variables that then we can provide when we deploy this either locally or in like a Docker Compose setup or in Cloud Run and GCP eventually. And so what we'll need to do here is implement some type of function or property that can read from those environment variables and build this application info class. And then we can leverage that when we're returning our more robust status response. So I'm going to implement that, I think, as just an extension property on the application class. So I'll make a note for that, add extension property on application class that will read env variables and construct the application info instance. Cool. And then we can test out the updated get status endpoint again. And then from here, we'll just continue on stubbing out the rest of these endpoints using the type safe routing. So we could update, let's say, could drop a line in here, stub out the get URLs endpoint to return a list of shortened data. Now, to do that, we will need to have some list of shortened data to actually return. So before we even do that, we'll add another note here. We could just stub out a repository. Stub out an in-memory repository that returns a hard-coded list of shortened URL instances. So we can use that then to stub out the get endpoint here. And then we can also use that to implement the get with the ID and hand us back one of those saved URLs using one of those IDs. And lastly here, we can stub out post URLs shorten endpoint. It should receive an instance of shorten URL request body as the post body. And we could add the post body info to the repository when received. So we could make that repository a little bit interactive. It's not going to persist it anywhere, certainly at this point, but within a given kind of running session of this locally, we should be able to add to our repository as we're working through this. So if I go ahead and then just preview this so we can read through this. So now we took our small set of acceptance criteria here, and we thought through kind of step by step how we might work through this. What are the dependencies that we're going to need to add to the project? What are any sort of base types that don't exist yet that we might need to add? Are there any sort of data sources, repositories, ways of interacting with data that we might need in support of our endpoints? And then finally, we wrote out kind of a set of steps here for how we might approach the building and the initial testing of these endpoints. So again, this is not an exact science, how we break down a task like this or multiple tasks like this. We got to find a style that makes sense to us. And as we get into this, I'm sure we're going to find places where we want to deviate from the plan a little bit, or we missed a step, or maybe we wrote these out in the wrong order. That's totally okay as well. We don't have to follow this plan super strictly. The idea is to build out a plan to give us a general roadmap, but also to help us think through it more critically so that we identify any potential challenges or blockers or just things that we don't know before we jump right into the code. So hopefully this is somewhat helpful. If you can kind of keep those things in mind as you're working through whether it's an individual task or a really large sort of cross-functional project, these same steps of just looking at each individual kind of acceptance criteria, functional requirement, technical challenge, and breaking them down into smaller and smaller subproblems and kind of documenting those and then sequencing those out into an execution plan, whether it's 3 bullet points or 20 pages of document, that process will really serve you well as you're going on and you're building your projects as a software developer. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's start building some code here. So I've got my project here in IntelliJ. And again, for reference, I'm using IntelliJ Ultimate, but for what we're doing here today, IntelliJ IDEA, the community edition, the free version, should work perfectly fine as well. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new branch here for working. We'll just call this basic routing. There we go. And let me close all the tabs. So again, if we come back here to our implementation plan, the first couple of steps here was to add the serialization plugin and the Ktor resources plugin. Or excuse me. Plugin. So that is actually Ktor resources plugin library dependency. It's not a Gradle plugin. It's a Ktor resource plugin. So let's just go kotlinx.serialization, because I don't remember the exact artifact that we need to add to the project. Okay, there we go. So I will come back in here, and since we are using a version catalog, I want to come into my libs.version.toml file here. And again, we've got our syntax in the version catalog here. You know, we've got our version numbers at the top, we've got our libraries, our bundles, and then down here, we've got the plugin section. And so in this case, it's going to be a plugin. I will add it here after Ktor. We'll just name this Kotlin serialization equals, and ID here. I don't know if this is actually the right ID. I always forget the correct way to reference the plugin, but I know we can use the Kotlin version here for the version. Let me just double check, see if this resolves. Okay, so far so good. Let's see if I can actually apply that to the project correctly then. So we'll come in here, and again, when using version catalogs and trying to reference a plugin from the version catalog in your plugins block within, in this case, our service module, we use this alias function, and then we reference libs, plugins, and then in our case, kotlin.serialization. And I'll resync just to make sure. Okay, yeah, that's what I was worried of. I don't have that plugin ID quite right. So what I'm going to do is come back here. I know I have another project where I've got the correct plugin ID, and I will just look at that real quick. Okay, that's right. I just needed to add the org JetBrains Kotlin bit to the beginning. That makes sense. So I'll come back to my version catalog here. Go ahead and add that in. And now let's resync. Perfect. So we've got the Kotlin serialization. Let's add a Ktor type safe routing, the resource plugin here. So if you're looking for this plugin, you'll search for it by type safe routing, and the actual dependency is this IO-Ktor server resources dependency. So again, I will grab this. Actually, just for fun here, we could demonstrate. If you take a dependency line, like an implementation block for your Gradle build script, and you just drop it into the dependencies section with proper version info and sync, the newer versions of the IDE, well, at least some of them, I don't know why mine here, some of the newer versions of the IDE will give you a refactoring intention here to pull this out into a version catalog. I am not sure why mine is not here. I'm getting a dependency warning, but I'm not getting the intention to extract into a dependency catalog. So that was a bad example, unfortunately. We'll see. I know this worked in Android Studio for me just the other day. So when we get to Android Studio work eventually, we'll probably have another chance to demonstrate that. But in any case, we will come back into our version catalog. And this time we're adding a library dependency. So we're adding it to the libraries section here of the version catalog. And I will go ahead and add Ktor server. We'll call this resources. And the module in this case will be that IO Ktor, Ktor server resources. And the version, we will use the Ktor version. Okay, and I'll just resync so we can get the type safe code generated. And here, so we could come back here to our dependencies block and we could do this. So we could just add this directly. Bundles Ktor server dot, excuse me, no. So we could do libs dot there we go, libs.ktor.server.resources, and just explicitly add this dependency. But as you may remember if you've been following along with the stream, or maybe not, so I'll review it anyways, we have multiple other Ktor related dependencies here, but we're not adding them all explicitly. We're leveraging the version catalog feature of dependency bundles. So if you can see here, we have this bundles dependency block, or declaration block, I guess. And we've defined a bundle here called Ktor server that includes the core JVM, default headers, call logging, and Netty engine dependencies. So what this allows us to do then is, in our dependency block, we specify this one bundle of dependencies, and it'll actually bring in all of those dependencies. So this is really nice. So we have a group of dependencies that are all kind of related. We don't want to have to put them all in explicitly. We can just add them to the bundle. So in this case, rather than adding that resources dependency directly, I am going to just add another one here to the bundle. So in this case, it will be Ktor server resources. And notice here, we're getting autocomplete. So it is recognizing these named dependencies from my libraries block and suggests the auto completion for that. So now if I resync, I should have access to all of the dependencies and plugins that we wanted to add for our project. So let me just come back to our implementation plan then, and I can go ahead and check off these first couple items. Okay, so now let's work on stubbing out some of these data types that we talked about. So if I come back to my source code, I am going to create a new package here called data. And since I'm going to start with the application info, I'm actually going to create a new class here, and I'm going to create this in another subpackage. I'm going to call this environment, and we will call this, I guess, application info again, just like we called out. I don't know if I love this name. I'm trying to decide. It should be application info, environment info. think it almost should be deployment environment. So I might refactor this. Actually, we'll call this deployment info. So you've got a deployment info, and like we mentioned in our acceptance criteria here, we want this to include some type of logical representation of the deployment environment, whether that's like local or dev or prod, and then want to have the revision number. So to do that, we can define a new, let's see, I'm going to do this as an enum class, I think. Do an enum class here, and we'll just call this environment. We'll call this deployment environment. It's a little less overloaded. And for the different values here, I want this to be local in case we're really just like running this locally running server. I'm going to do one here called Docker. If it's running locally via Docker or in a Docker Compose setup. And then I will define dev and prod, which we will eventually down the line deploy to. So this is good for the moment, I think. So if we come back to our deployment info, we could start adding to this. So we can make this a data class that will have val, it'll have a deployment environment, and we'll have a revision. We could just be a string here. So we can use this then when we do a status endpoint to basically tell us, are we running like locally and which version, or are we in prod and which version? And this is helpful if we are testing and, we might run the status endpoint in dev and see, oh, we're running 2.3, and we might run it in prod and see, oh, we're on 2.1. So that can be helpful. Also just helpful to make sure that the service was kind of deployed correctly with the environment variables and everything that it expects. And if you don't have that, you could even do things like throw exceptions and whatnot, so you find it very early on. And this info, this deployment info, the reason we're sort of adding this, one, to give us more kind of debugging info with respect to runtime deployment and stuff, or debugging locally deployments, but also we can use this eventually to also look up and extract configuration data regarding like database connections and load balancers and things like that when we need to change some of those base configuration values based on which environment we're in. So that should be a good start here for our application info. Now we can create our shortened URL data class. So I'll again create a new data class here. We will call this, actually want to make sure that this is in data/shortened URL. There we go. And so like we talked about for the shortened URL, we might give this LID. This is likely be an identifier into some type of data store, probably a database of some kind in the future. So we might want to rethink the ID eventually, but for the moment, we could just give this a type of long, and then val URL, and for the moment we could just represent this as a string. So this should be enough. I just want to double check some notes from a previous example I did here and see if there is anything else useful that I added that I want to go ahead and update here. So let me go through this other repo quick, whoops, ID, title, URL key. Yeah, that's right. We'll need our key into that we would use to identify this that can be independent of the ID. So the ID can be the database ID, whereas this shortened key could be something that's a little bit more user-friendly that you would think of passing around as your kind of URL shortener slug. So we'll go ahead and add that, say URL key. And the other thing that I did like there is I think there was a title property. In this case, I think I want to do something like description. I'll make this optional. So let me just move this to the bottom. And the reason for that is if I'm imagining let's say, building this URL shortener service to be like a SaaS product, software as a service product. And if I'm a user of that, I want to shorten a URL, I might want to provide some kind of description or metadata representing what this was. So you might be my blog post on new Kotlin features or something like that, and then associate with the URL. That way, if you're looking through kind of your list of information, you have a better sense of what each of the URLs is, because the URL itself might not be all that easy to identify. So I think having some type of description property here is useful for us. Okay, we check that off, and now we want the shortened URL request body. So we'll go ahead and add that last one here. Shortened URL request body, there we go. Again, I'm going to make this a data class, and we will say that this should include the URL, and it will return, or it will include an optional description. There we go. Perfect. So I can check that off. Now, like I said, as you're going through your implementation plan, you'll probably remember things that you've forgotten. And so, in fact, I just thought of something that I should come in here and make sure that I add. So, oops, there we go. We added some of these types, but I mentioned at the beginning that we want to use these types to receive from our post endpoint or to return as responses. And we're going to use the content negotiation for that, along with the kotlinx.serialization plugin. And so to do that, we will need to annotate the types that we want to serialize with the serializable annotation here. So mark necessary types with @serializable. So let me save that, and we will go tackle that next. So the first one here, the thing that made me think of it, was this body. We want to receive this from a post request. So I will go ahead and start just typing @serializable and go ahead and hit enter on that. And so you'll see that that's going to pull in the kotlinx serialization serializable annotation. And this is what will let the kotlinx serialization plugin build a serializer for this object, and that'll allow us to receive it as this typed object as opposed to just like a JSON string. And the other one we want to add this to is our serializable annotation on the shortened URL type. And if I remember correctly, I think we also might eventually need to add some serialize, or to add a custom serializer to this. So we want to return this in our status body. So we will definitely need serializable here. And by extension, we're going to want this then on our enum type. And if I remember correctly, we might need to provide a custom serializable for here to the enum. I've done that in the past, but I can't remember if I had to do it or if I just wanted to do it for some reason. So I'm not going to worry about any of that now, and we will see if that need actually arises here. So we've got that. All right. So we've stubbed out. We've got our dependencies and plugins. We've created our data types. Now we're ready to actually start working through stubbing out some endpoints. So let me just close all of these tabs. So to start adding to our endpoints, I want to start at the beginning, start at how we configure our application. So we come back to application KT here, and the entry point for your Ktor service here is this main function. And then within that, you call this embedded server function, which is going to stand up the embedded server using the engine that you specify. So in our case, Netty. You can specify port and host, and then you give it a function to basically configure your application. So in this case, it's this module parameter here, and we're giving it a function reference here to this module function on the application type. And then within it, we have currently these 3 extension methods. So the one that we're particularly interested in at the moment is this configure routing function. And so we can see here that we have a routing block, and within that, we have a single route defined at the moment. So we use this get function with a string that is just a /. So what this translates into is a HTTP verb, in this case, a get request at the path, which in this case, the / represents just the root path on the URL. So we could test this by just quickly running this, and this is going to just run the server engine locally here on my machine at basically localhost here 8080. And oops, that opened in not the window I wanted it to. So here I'll drop that URL into my browser here, and if I just zoom in a little bit, you see that it responded with hello world. So that is exactly what we were expecting to see here. We can see in our call block here, we are just responding with some plain text hello world. So this is the basic most route that we get when we stood up our new Ktor project. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this, and we're going to start stubbing out our set of routes that we want here, or our endpoints, if you will. When I say route, really could think of that synonymous with endpoint for the most part in this case. So like I said before, the place to start with these is with these functions that correlate to our REST endpoint, or excuse me, our RESTful verbs. So again, our get, put, post, delete. So again, in our case, we want that get /status. So I'm going to start here by typing get, and then my path for this particular route is going to be /status, /status. And then we pass in a function to it, in this case using trailing lambda syntax. And now within this, we have a receiver type that is the pipeline context. So this lets us reference the application call, and that is what we can then reference when we type call here and do things like respond with different types of data. So in our case here, we're going to keep this very simple for the moment, and I'm going to respond with an HTTP status code of OK. So this is kind of the most basic version of our status endpoint. Just we call it, and it returns OK if the service is up and running. So I'm going to test this again But this time I am going to test this in a slightly different way. So rather than just like going to my browser, which isn't going to help me that much because I'm not responding with text anymore, I'd have to go look at like the developer tools to actually see if it worked or not. I'm going to call this from within IntelliJ itself. So I'm going to open up the Endpoints tool window, which I can see here on my toolbar. Or if I were to go to my menu, I could go View, Tools, and find Endpoints. There we go. And this is a feature that I do think actually is specific to IntelliJ Ultimate. This is one reason I actually really like the paid version of IntelliJ here. It works really well with Ktor, and it can recognize the routes in this project. So when I open this up, it is recognizing that I have this status GET request here. And so if I click on that, it will allow me to basically use the HTTP client built into IntelliJ to make requests against this endpoint and test it in a really convenient way. So by default here, it's asking if I want to test this at localhost/status. This is a placeholder that I can set up, or I can just be more explicit with it in the moment here. So I'll just be explicit with it because I don't want to set up the environment variables and stuff for it to define localhost. But once I have that, I should be able to just run this. It's angry at me. I do not know why. Here, let me stop running this for a moment. So here I clicked open an editor, and it just pulled up this this HTTP client file. So this is something that you can do in IntelliJ Ultimate as well, is just define a .http file and define these requests in there, very much like you can with Postman. So here it will allow me to run this. In this case, it failed because I had stopped the service just to see if that's what was causing the problem. So let me run this once again, and then we'll test this out again. There we go. So now I can come in here and I can run that. There we go. There we go. So this time it worked. So we can see that down here in our logs for the service, we can see that it did the matching of the get method here and the /status. And in the HTTP client section in our endpoints window here, we can see that we got, response body is empty, but we got a response code of 200. So that's exactly what we want. You can play with this endpoints tool and the built-in HTTP client more, probably do a dedicated video on it at some point, because I think this is a really helpful tool to be really productive in your IDE when you're building out a service like this. So let's just go back here. So we've got our get status stubbed out. We tested out our endpoint. So now we're ready to start introducing the type safe resources into the application. So I am going to do a little bit of code organization here. I'm going to create a new package, and I am going to call this resources. And I'm going to create a new file here called status. And I'm going to basically pull that existing function out of there. And I'm going to create a new function here. It's going to be an extension on application. Actually, excuse me, it's going to be an extension on routing dot status. And I'll add that call there. So that's just going to clean up this routing block a little bit. So now I can just add my status function here, and that adds the status route. And what we want to do is define basically a type safe object here that represents this route path. I think this makes more sense when you see it. So I'm just going to create, in this case, I'm going to do a data object called status. And I'm going to annotate this with resource, which takes in a path. And I'm going to give it the path of /status. And so now with that in place, I can replace this path down here in our get function with that object. And I just need to import the new get. I always forget what the path here is on this one. Let me go, let's see, type safe routing. We've got the docs here. This should help us. Here we go. Oh, and of course they don't show the import there for that particular route handler. Dang. Here we go. This should do it. When in doubt, go to the docs here. That's right. It just comes from the resources dependency. That makes sense. So I could do this resources dot get. And yet that still did not do it. What did we do wrong here? We've got the resource annotation. Right. Oh, yes. We need to install the resources call pipeline. Yep. So when you add a new, a Ktor plugin to the project, we need to make sure that we add it here as well. So I'm going to go to my plugins package. Let's create a new file here. We'll call this resources. And we will do extension function, figure, say type safe routing, install resource. Let me fix this typo here. There we go. Configure type safe routing, install resources. I think that was right. Install resources. Yep. So let's see, something just didn't resolve the dependency quite right here. Resource. Ktor server resources, Ktor resources. See, is it resources or resource? Let me double check. Resources, yeah. There. All right, so which one of these do we got to pull in here? Server resources or Ktor resources? There. So we had to pull in the Ktor server resources. dependency. There we go. Okay, so we've installed the plugin to the pipeline now, or we've got it created a function for it, and then now we can add that here. All right, and now we should be able to come back here and hopefully get this to update to accept our resource. No, it's still not for some reason here. What have we missed? Ktor server resources, post put. Let me just see what happens if I do this. No, that doesn't matter. Did we grab the wrong plugin here? Ktor resources. No, I think that is correct. All right. I've run into this problem before, but it usually has been very easy to just grab the correct resource and find the getter. So I've got one that accepts a path. All right, let me do this. Let me just resync here. Make sure everything, all the dependencies are being found properly. And let me double check. Yep, that is an extension on. Oh, I know what I've been doing wrong here. We don't pass it in. It's part of the generic type of the function. So I need to use get with in angled brackets status, and then we can pass in our function. That was the problem. There we go. So if I go ahead and call dot respond with our OK status code again. Basically, what we've done here is moved the kind of declaration of the route path itself, along with arguments like parameters, or like query parameters, path parameters, such. We moved that into this object here. So we could define those at a top level, and then the routes themselves don't have to include all of that information in the route. So I like this because I think it helps from an organization standpoint a little bit. And we'll also see eventually when working with, say, again, like a path parameter, it can automatically parse that out for us, which is really helpful. So now that we've got this, let me just rerun this one more time. We can validate that our status endpoint continues to work. All right, so I just ran that, and we still get our status code of 200. Okay, perfect. All right, so we've updated status to use the type-safe resource plugin. Now let's go work through adding that environment info to this. So I'm going to come down here to my application type here, and I want to define a extension property here on application. And let's see, what did we call that? Called it deployment info. That's right. So I'm going to call this deployment info of type deployment info. And I want this to be let's see, can we do this by lazy and create an instance of a deployment info object. So we're going to create a lazily, we're going to create an extension property here that will be lazily evaluated to basically look up this info the first time it's called and construct this deployment info object. And so basically what we need to do here then is sort of extract deployment environment and convert to our enum, extract deployment revision, and then build our deployment info object. So to do this, we're probably going to need to just pull from like the system environment variables to read those out. And then when we deploy that, we can set those environment variables as part of, say, our CI/CD pipelines. So again, I'm going to go look at a reference implementation where I've kind of done this kind of thing already. And what we can do here is reference sort of the environment, and we can get properties from the environment here. And in this case, I believe, yeah, so that is coming from this application comp file here, where we can set kind of environment variables, and we can set our revision number, and then we can kind of insert those into kind of the environment again at like build and deploy time through Docker or other means. So I am going to update the application here to use this application.conf file. And that is going to require just a couple of things. But first, I will just come into the resource packages in the source directory here, create a new file. It's like application conf. And we could paste this in. And we're going to ignore that extension for now. And then when using the application conf here, so this is basically, using a configuration file instead of configuring via code, we want to change the way we structure the main function ever so slightly. So what we'll do here is come back to our application, and instead of configuring all this stuff here in our embedded server, we're going to update our main function to look like this. And this main function here, if I downloaded the configuration and everything, or downloaded the sources, what it's going to do is automatically look to read from this file and pull the configuration from this file. So we just want to make sure that the paths here match on our module. So we have dev goobar application KT module. So dev goobar application KT module. So that should work fine. And we're using the engine main from the Netty package. So this should work perfectly. So now what we can do here is can say val. Actually, let me take a step back. So what we want to do here then is read these environments. So I want to read the environment here and the revision. So let me grab this. Hold on. Let's see. environment. Where is this coming from? All right, let me see here. I forget exactly where. I thought that was coming from the application type. Let me. Oh, I think it is, but because I'm in this lazy delegate here, I don't have access to that in scope. So what I will do here is, for the moment, I'll change this to use a custom getter. There we go. That was the problem. So by doing this as a custom getter, this is not going to be lazily cached, but this gives me access to the environment. So when you're configuring your Ktor service here using the config file, or the comp file, we can pull properties out of that by using this syntax. So we say environment config, and we can get a property. And so in this case, we're looking for Ktor environment. So in that case, this will handle the nesting. So it'll say ktor.environment. And what this syntax is doing here is saying provide a default value of local, but then if any environment variable of ktor_env was passed along when we built the project, then substitute that value in instead. And the same thing here for the revision. So by default, it'll be revision 0. So with that, then we can use this info here to create the deployment info object. So we have our deployment environment. So we want to convert the environment property into this enum. So we'll say env equals deployment env. And what we really want to do here is value of env property. Oh, that's right. We have to do dot get string, and then I'm going to do uppercase on this. So when you access a property from the config, it comes back as a application config value. So by calling get string, we can unwrap that to the underlying value, and then I'll call uppercase on this to match with the enum expectations. So now I can create the deployment info by passing env and revision property. This will also then need to be get string. And let's see, there we go. Yep. Just add my return. There we go. Perfect. So now we have a way to build one of these deployment info objects. Let's use this in our actual route. So if we come back to status here, instead of call respond with OK, we could do call respond with OK and pass in call dot application dot deployment info. And that should respond back then with that deployment info object that we are going to extract and read. So let's run this again. Good, that's still running. And I'm going to come back here, going to test this out. Let's see. Response body is empty. Okay, so I did not structure that quite right. I think maybe I need to change which I use here. Let me go double check this. There's lots of these response ones. I want to make sure I'm using... Actually, I should also double check. Do I have content negotiation installed? Monitoring, HTTP type safe routing. I think that's the problem. I have not added content negotiation. So again, a small piece of the implementation plan that we missed initially. So we'll come back and we'll update that as needed now. So what we can do here is add the content negotiation library to our version catalog. So I'll add that after the resources block here. So you can see it's Ktor server content negotiation JVM. And then I'll add that to my bundle. Another reason the bundle is really nice because we can do all of this just from the version catalog without having to actually go and update the build script file. And then, let's see, we've got that. Then we can come back to our application. I'm going to create a new, actually, I'm going to go to the HTTP and I'm going to install content negotiation. And I think I forget exactly how we want to configure this. Ktor content negotiation. So we'll go to the docs here. So we added the dependency. Oh, and yes, we have one more dependency we want to add. So we want to add Ktor serialization JSON so we can provide the specific sort of deserialization strategy for the content negotiation plugin to use. So again, we'll come back here, one more dependency and one more for the bundle. And while that's syncing, we can then come back here, and when we install content negotiation, we'll just specify the JSON deserializer here. There we go. There we go. So now we've got content negotiation installed. It's set up to use JSON deserializer, and it knows how to work with the Kotlin X serialization plugin that we updated earlier. So now let's rerun our application and see if our... Oh, whoops, I need to... There we go. I need to put that call back to the state it was in. All right, so we're rerunning. There we go. So this time I ran the status here, and we see that environment is coming back as local, and revision is showing as 0, which is what we were hoping for there. So let's try this one more time. I'm going to stop the service. Let's go back to the conf file. And we see here we've got Ktor env. So just out of fun, let's see if we can update the environment variable that we're going to pass to this. I forget exactly. I think right here should do it. So I opened up my run configurations and I'm selecting the application KT1. This is the run configuration I've been working with. Here, let me just rename this so it's less confusing. There we go. So I've got my run configuration here, and there's this environment variables field we can configure. So I'm going to open this up and I'm going to add a new environment variable with a name of ktor_env and a value of, let's say this time, I'm going to call it Docker. Even though I'm not actually running this for Docker, we're just going to set that environment variable. We're going to hit apply. And let's run that. And let's see. Perfect. So yeah, so it recognized that environment variable was set. So then when sort of the application was built and run, it detected that environment was there and substituted it into the application configuration. And then we were able to read that and parse that into sort of our predetermined set of known deployment environments. And so now when we run this, we see, Docker being shown here, which again, in this particular case is not correct, but it will be useful when we get into different sort of local deployment environment strategies, and we will set up a Docker Compose configuration so that we would be able to then identify if this was running locally from Docker or via the IDE here. So I'm just going to go back here and remove that just so I don't forget about it in the future. There we go. Hit apply. Excellent. So let's come here. We've got our extension property. We test out our new endpoint. We just have a few more minutes before I need to take off. So let me just look at what we've got going on here. Stub out in-memory repository returns hard-coded list of shortened URLs. Okay, we can do that, I think. Let me see if I already have a version of that somewhere. No, but we could do that in the future. So actually, because I only have a few minutes and I don't want to rush through this, I'm going to wind it down here. And next week, I'm traveling for work, and so we'll not be streaming on Thursday, but instead, I think I'm going to try to do a very short stream like Monday morning before I leave. So maybe take like a half an hour Monday, and we can finish out these last couple of steps from our implementation plan here and finish stubbing out these endpoints. So I think that is roughly where I will wind down today. Let me just kind of quickly give, I guess, the overview of what we did here. So again, we worked through just a general exercise on how we could convert some acceptance criteria into a usable implementation plan and some of that logical thinking of how to break down, a larger task into executable smaller tasks. And then we came into our project code here, and we added several new plugins and dependencies to our version catalog. So we added the Kotlin serialization plugin, and then we added type-safe resources, content negotiation, and JSON serialization dependencies to the project. We defined some data holders here to represent the environment that we're deployed in to use in our status endpoint. We created a data type here to hold shortened URL information that we'll work with in our next stream to implement a couple of the endpoints. We implemented a data class here to represent a post body to represent some URL information that we want to go ahead and save into our eventually database. And then we updated our service to work with a configuration file here in kind of a hook-on file syntax kind of standard, and be able to substitute in environment variables when we sort of build and deploy the application, so that we can configure that application info object, or excuse me, the deployment info object based on those environments. And again, that'll come in handy in the future when we're deploying this either via IDE or Docker Compose, or to Cloud Run in our dev environment or our prod environment. And kind of the last thing we did then was we looked at how we can use the endpoints tool window in IntelliJ Ultimate to be able to test these endpoints right from the IDE in a very Postman-like fashion. And we were able to see that we were in fact getting back these JSON bodies from our type safe responses coming from our status endpoint. So we really covered a lot of ground today. We will continue in the next stream with stubbing out those remaining endpoints and just kind of looking to the future then in our project. Once we finish stubbing out the initial endpoints, we'll probably take half a step back and start looking at a couple other things here. Maybe look at some setting up some basic project documentation structures, and then probably look at setting up like some linting and some testing and really getting a lot of the project basics in place that you'd want in a production application. So testing, linting, we'll look at CI/CD and deployments, and really probably before getting too much further into actual implementation details, we'll go ahead and get this thing like deployable and accessible via Google Cloud Run. So that'll probably cover the next several streams, but just wanted to kind of give a quick outline of where we're going. So probably just going to pull over, set up project documentation as the up next. So we'll probably have one more stream on endpoints, and then we'll do some documentation. We'll chat about that. And probably, let's see, we'll do linting. Yeah, linting, testing. Yeah, this is actually probably about the order we'll do them in here in the to-do category. So let's see. Just to, before kind of winding down here, let me go back to the chat here. Okay, let's see. No open questions, but yes, I do see comment there related to exposed DB ORM. I do think exposed is probably something we'll look at. I want to play with both flavors of exposed, as well as probably we'll look at SQLite at some point as well. Want to explore different libraries here for interacting with our database and see what kind of feels best to me. So we'll probably have several streams dedicated to that. But probably once we get past the point of deployment and general developer productivity setup stuff. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and wind the stream down today. Thank you for everybody that joined in, for all the comments. If you have questions in the future or topic ideas, feel free to reach out to me. You can leave comment on the video, reach out on social media, whatever works best for you. And I will see you all in our next stream. Have a good one.